Hello, and welcome to the Genealogy Radio Show, the radio show that's keeping you in the loop. This episode, I'm going to be talking about one of the most famous Murphys, Diarmuit MacMurchad. Before that, though, I feel like a small introduction is necessary. In Ireland, we're often taught about events such as the 1798 rebellion and the 1916 Rising, and other similarly independence-focused events. However, something that is neglected, at least it was in my own education, is how the English came to be in Ireland in the first place. I say the English, but at this point I'm really talking about the Anglo-Normans, the people who first sailed across the Channel with the intention of carving out territory for themselves in Ireland. These people were a colourful blend of England's Saxon natives and the ruling Norman aristocracy that had defeated the Saxons at the Battle of Hastings in 1066. In Irish schools, the focus appears to be on Ireland's status as a victim of colonialism, and without a doubt, for centuries the island suffered in this way. There was a time, though, when the English had nothing to do with Ireland, until Diarmuit MacMurchad ran into some difficulties. In this radio show, I'm going to discuss the events that led to the arrival of the Normans in Ireland, and focus in particular on the King of Leinster at the time, whose dire need forced him to invite them. I'll begin by giving some background on Diarmuit MacMurchad, sometimes known as Dermot MacMurrough. The name MacMurchad roughly translates to the common Irish name Murphy today, which is something I touched upon in a previous episode of the Genealogy Radio Show, when I explored the history of the Murphys and Kellys. As prestigious ancestors go, having Diarmuit MacMurchad in your family tree is nothing to be sniffed at. Diarmuit was born around 1110 to Duncad MacMurchad, who was King of Leinster at the time. In this period of history, Ireland was a dense mix of many different petty kingdoms. In Europe, these kingdoms would not have been referred to as such, but this was simply the way the Irish chiefs styled themselves at the time. In later centuries, many of these kingdoms were broken up into yet smaller pieces and reorganised into earldoms by the English. In this time period, though, all of Ireland was divided up into these small kingdoms, where each chief was the sole lord of all he surveyed. Returning to the story of the MacMurchads, Diarmuit's family was a well-connected one, politically speaking. His paternal great-grandmother, Derb Forgal, was daughter to Duncad, King of Munster, making her a granddaughter of Brian Baroo. Through this family connection, the MacMurchads could maintain a distant but solid claim on the Kingdom of Munster to their west. Diarmuit was the younger of Duncad's two sons. His older brother, Enna MacMurchad, became King of Leinster in around 1117, following the death of his cousin, Diarmuit MacEnna, that year. The rule of Enna was characterised by a period of mostly peaceful relations with the rest of Ireland, apart from an uprising that the King of Leinster took part in against the High King of Ireland at the time, Twelfth-century in 1124. I feel it's necessary to make a small point about the Irish High Kings, as it's a topic that many people have difficulty with. The concept of the High Kingship in Ireland can sometimes be confusing, as there were often several claimants at any one time, and few, if any, ever laid claim to the entire Ireland. Brian Baroo, the famous King of Munster, came closest to achieving a true conquest of the island, but was assassinated by his enemies following the defeat of a Viking-Irish alliance aligned against him. After the death of Brian at the hands of his assassins, no claimant to the title of High King ever managed to achieve so great a measure of control over the island. Returning to the story of Enna MacMurchad, he was luckily shown mercy following the conclusion of the revolt he'd taken part in. The High King did not execute him for his role in the revolt, and actually returned his kingship in Leinster to him as a gesture of goodwill. Unfortunately for the usually lucky ruler of Leinster, he was to die unexpectedly in 1126, and this left the stage open for his younger brother, Diarmuit MacMurchad, to take control of the kingdom. The ascension of Diarmuit to the throne of Leinster was strongly opposed by Tordelbach Gu Conchobar, the High King at the time. He saw in Diarmuit a potential rival for his planned conquests and decided to remove him by force. For the task of laying the kingdom of Leinster low, Tuatha Dé Bach selected one of his subjects named Tigernán O'Rourke. Tigernán was the king of Brefna, a kingdom in modern Connacht composed of what is now County Leitrim and Cavan, as well as portions of other counties. Tigernán had a bit of a reputation for being a wild man, and his callous attitude would be put to good use by the High King at the time against Diarmuid mac Murchad. Assigned the task of removing Diarmuid from power, Tigernán went on a brutal campaign in Leinster, where he spent much of his time slaughtering livestock in order to starve the population of the kingdom. The slaughter of cattle was particularly significant, as not only did it starve the population, it also heavily damaged Diarmuid's status, as cattle ownership was so important in Ireland at the time. The assault ultimately proved too much for Diarmuid's fledgling regime, and he was ousted from power soon after. This event was the start of the quarrel between Diarmuid and Tigernán, which would culminate in events that would shape the fabric of Ireland for centuries to come. Never the type to take bad news lying down, Diarmuid spent almost 10 years gathering support for his claim to the throne, until he was eventually restored to his birthright in 1132 by the clans of Leinster. Surprisingly, the return of Diarmuid to the throne of Leinster did not provoke another attack from the High King. Oddly enough, relations between the two sides appear to have been relatively peaceful. Diarmuid's rule continued uninterrupted until 1166, when his feud with Tigernán O'Rourke came back to bite him. As an insult, Diarmuid had kidnapped Tigernán's wife, Derb Forgal. The implication is that he kept her as a mistress to really rub salt on the wound. The feud between the two kings was by now a very long-standing affair, and this final insult propelled Tigernán into a rage. To punish Diarmuid for his transgressions, a coalition was formed. Tigernán and the new High King, Ruaidhrí Ó Conchobar, resolved to march on Leinster and remove Diarmuid for good. For Tigernán, the king of Brefna, it was a personal affair, but for the new High King, it was an opportunity to brush aside a potential rival. As you can imagine, this left Diarmuid in a tricky position. He was a man with few friends, and many of his neighbours had sworn fealty to the new High King rather than resist his large army. Surrounded by enemies and with nowhere else to turn, Diarmuid decided to flee the island and search for help across the Channel in Anglo-Norman England. Diarmuid travelled with what remained of his household to Wales, and from there between England and France, seeking Henry II. When he finally secured an audience with the king, Diarmuid petitioned him for help with retaking his kingdom in Leinster. Henry was not entirely opposed to supporting Diarmuid's claim, but did not give direct support to the undertaking. He did, however, give Diarmuid permission to recruit soldiers and mercenaries in England that he could take back across the Irish Sea with him. Accepting the resolution of King Henry, Diarmuid secured the help of 3 prominent Norman knights. These men were Robert Fitzstephen, Maurice Fitzgerald, and Richard de Clare, the 2nd Earl of Pembroke, who was otherwise known by his nickname, Strongbow. Strongbow is a name that many of our listeners who are familiar with the period will be aware of already, but we should not discount the lesser members of the group who agreed to aid Diarmuid in his quest to reclaim his lands. From a genealogical perspective, this event represents the introduction of a whole wealth of new family names into Ireland that had not previously existed there in any real numbers. The name Fitzgerald, in particular, is a famous one in Irish history, and I have talked about it at some length in a Fitzgerald episode of the Genealogy radio show concerning the House of Kildare. It has often been said that the Normans were hungry for land more than anything else, and as a result, Diarmuid was obliged to offer his Norman mercenaries lands of their own in Ireland. Strongbow was promised the whole kingdom of Leinster upon Diarmuid's death, as well as the hand of his daughter Aoife in marriage to secure the deal. Fitzstephen and Fitzgerald were meanwhile offered land in Wexford and elsewhere for their services. With the aid of Fitzstephen in particular, Diarmuid was able to gather to him an army of Welsh and English mercenaries while resting in Wales. The Welsh had grown to be vicious fighters through their long history of conflict with the Normans, and so proved particularly useful in the coming fight. When Diarmuit felt he had gathered a large enough force, he and his Norman companions sailed across the sea to Ireland and came ashore at Baroo Bay on the southwest coast of modern County Wexford. Diarmuit's first target was the town of Wexford itself, but before they could get there, they were halted by a mixed force of Gaels and Norsemen at Duncormac, roughly 18 kilometres from Wexford. While this skirmish was only a small affair and ended in a swift victory for Diarmuit and his Norman allies, it is significant. The skirmish at Duncormac can be pointed to as the first attempt by the Irish to resist the impositions of foreign power from England. When you look at it, this same struggle would go on for another 800 years. With victory at Duncormac, Diarmuit's forces marched on to Wexford to lay siege to the town. The defenders, of course, knew that Diarmuit was coming, and they'd initially thought to meet him on the field outside the town. However, upon seeing the mighty armoured host that was bearing down on them, the defenders instead burned the town's outbuildings to deny the Normans shelter and shut the gates. When Diarmuit arrived at the town and saw that it was held against him, he ordered his men to set up camp and prepare for a siege. As sieges go, Diarmuit's attack on Wexford is not the most exciting affair. The Norman soldiers made only one assault upon the walls, where it is said they lost 18 men. The very next day, the defenders of the town sent a messenger to Diarmuit, offering to renew their oaths of loyalty to him if he would spare the town. It is claimed that this abrupt surrender was promoted by 2 bishops within the town, who convinced the defenders that resistance was hopeless. Wexford fell to Diarmuit in 1169, and a brief period of inactivity followed this, while the prodigal king decided his next move. Following this, Diarmuit and his men exploded out of Leinster and raided the kingdom of Osroyga, which encompasses modern County Kilkenny and western County Laois. More raids followed soon after into the territories of the Ututhul, the Ubrone, and Conchobar Foilia. Leinster and the regions around it were thrown into bloody turmoil by Diarmuit on his quest to reclaim his throne. Initially it seemed as though nothing could stop him, but there was one small hitch in his plans. It was common practice in medieval Ireland to take hostages. Oftentimes these hostages were actually freely given as a token of goodwill, while at other times they had to be extracted by force. It had long been the practice of the High Kings of Ireland to take hostages as a means of ensuring the obedience of their vassal kings. Ruaidhrí Ó Conchobar, the High King at the time, was in possession of Diarmuit's youngest son, Conchobar MacMurchad. It seems that Diarmuit believed Ruaidhrí simply didn't have the stomach to execute a young man like Conchobar for the sins of his father, and it was because of this fact he felt it was safe to take up the quest for the throne of Leinster. However, Diarmuit had not gambled on the enmity that Tigernán O'Rourke still held against him. It was Tigernán that pressured High King Ó Conchobar into executing his Leinster hostages, Diarmuit's youngest among them. The loss of his youngest son cut Diarmuit deeply, and he must have felt that he was responsible for the boy's death. Diarmuit never really recovered from this loss, though he fought on after it. High King Ruaidhrí, filled with resolve following the hostage executions, finally dealt with his other distractions and organised an army to come down and deal with the troublesome Diarmuit. In the end, no final battle was to take place, as is often the case in these matters. No king or general wants to see their soldiers die needlessly, so instead of fighting straight away, the 2 armies met at Ferns, Diarmuit's former capital in Leinster. Here, High King Ruaidhrí and Diarmuit came to an agreement. Diarmuit would recognise Ruaidhrí as High King of Ireland, and Diarmuit would be allowed to maintain his kingship in Leinster. In A History of Medieval Ireland, Ruthven claims that a secret agreement was struck alongside the public declaration that Diarmuit would bring no more mercenaries into Ireland and would send away his Norman knights as soon as Leinster was fully subdued. In reality, however, the floodgates had been opened, and Diarmuit could not stem the flow of Norman adventurers into Ireland even if he wanted to. 1170 saw the arrival of yet more Norman troops, including Strongbow himself. Both Dublin and Waterford were taken by Norman forces, and the promised marriage between Diarmuit's daughter Aoife and Strongbow took place soon after, allegedly in the ruins of Waterford. Diarmuit did not long outlive the captured Waterford. It has been theorized that the death of his youngest son was too much of a burden for him, and that it sped on his approaching death, as he was already quite an elderly man for the time. He died on roughly the 1st of May, 1171, having irrevocably changed the face of Ireland forever. Later sources refer to the King of Leinster as Diarmuit Nall, meaning Diarmuit of the foreigners in Irish. The Norman occupation only increased in pace following Diarmuit's death, as Henry II himself invaded the island, mostly to rein in his vassal Strongbow, who was becoming much too powerful for Henry's liking. The stage was now set for 800 years of war, famine, and general misery that we're all so familiar with. I feel that it is tremendously important to have a good understanding of this period, as the greater part of early modern, and indeed modern, Irish history would have been radically different without it. I hope that you've enjoyed this account of the life and times of Diarmuit MacMurchot, and I also hope that this episode has given you a greater context for the history of Ireland that you may be more familiar with. Thank you for listening.